In an industry where most rappers spend more time protecting their legend than actually building it, Rick Ross just walked directly into the most publicly humiliating week hip-hop has produced in 15 years, and the fallout is so loud that even people who never listened to a Rick Ross song are pulling up chairs. This is not a bad week. This is not a rough rollout. This is a full-scale, industry-wide, algorithm-confirmed detonation of a legacy, and the man holding the trigger was not Drake. It was not Kendrick Lamar. It was not Jay-Z. It was a rapper sitting in a federal facility with no phone, no press run, no radio, no interviews, no anything, who quietly outsold Rick Ross by a margin so ugly that Tony Yayo grabbed the microphone within hours and refused to put it down. And by the time you finish this breakdown, you're going to understand exactly why every A&R executive, every label suit, every podcast host, and every rival rapper is quietly laughing at Rick Ross behind the closed doors of every industry group chat that matters. Pause with me for one beat, because before we open the autopsy on Set in Stone, you already know the drill. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment, because the Rosie Rescue Committee is already flooding every timeline trying to spin a Groupon meltdown into a victory lap, and we are not letting the payroll pundits rewrite this one on our watch. Hip-hop family, buckle in, because this story is uglier than anything the Copers predicted, and the receipts are stacking so fast that even Rick Ross himself has switched into damage control mode with the kind of speech nobody outside of a Basquiat comparison would ever be desperate enough to deliver. This one is going to require your full attention. So put the phone down, close the other tabs, and lock in with me for the next 15 minutes, because we are about to walk through the coldest commercial collapse hip-hop has witnessed since the last major label lost the streaming war. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the surface of this story is loud, but the machinery underneath is louder. Rick Ross, 20-year veteran, Maybach Music Group commander, the self-appointed patron saint of luxury rap, the same Rick Ross who once moved 150,000 units in a single week without breaking his boat cruise routine, just released Set in Stone into the marketplace. Rick Ross moved 17,200 units. Of that number, roughly 2,000 were physical copies. And on the exact same chart, in the exact same window, a rapper named Tory Lanez, currently incarcerated, currently unreachable, currently doing zero press, zero podcasts, zero tour dates, zero social media, zero anything, quietly moved 19,700 units with a project titled Made You Think I Was Gone. Rick Ross did not just get outsold. Rick Ross got outsold by a man in a state-issued jumpsuit. Not by a margin, by 2,500 units. 2,500. That is the number that broke the internet in half. That is the number that turned hip-hop Twitter into a fireworks display. That is the number Rick Ross will spend the rest of his career trying to explain away. Here is the shape of it. Rick Ross spent the last 4 months as the loudest passenger on the promotional carousel. Every microphone that opened, Rick Ross found. Every podcast host that dialed, Rick Ross answered. Patrick Bet-David got a Rick Ross sit-down. Joe Budden got a Rick Ross sit-down. Big Boy got a Rick Ross sit-down. Every single one of those conversations, without a single exception, was hijacked by the same subject, Drake. Drake's music was horrendous, Rick Ross said. Drake wasn't writing his own verses, Rick Ross said. Drake wasn't on Rick Ross's level, Rick Ross said. The Iceman album was a flop. The Iceman album was ass. The Iceman rollout was embarrassing. Rick Ross even shifted his own release calendar backwards, not once, but multiple times, dodging Drake's 5th-week momentum like a boxer ducking a jab. And after all of that maneuvering, after all of that ducking, after all of that repositioning, guess who buried Rick Ross anyway? Not Drake this time. Tory Lanez. From a cell. Read that back to yourself twice. From a cell. And the second you understand that sentence in its full weight, you understand why Rick Ross is currently sailing around South Florida in a bathrobe, trying to invent a new definition of victory. Let me hand you one more receipt before we get to the man who lit the match. Tory Lanez had no radio push, no cover story, no algorithmic tailwind, no streaming playlist injection, no feature run, nothing. Meanwhile, Rick Ross had every single tool a legacy artist could pray for. Rick Ross had MMG distribution. Rick Ross had physical inventory in Target and Best Buy. Rick Ross had a full podcast circuit. Rick Ross had a decade of goodwill in the industry. Rick Ross had feature after feature after feature. Rick Ross had every advantage stacked in his corner, and Rick Ross still came in beneath a man who cannot even physically touch a microphone right now. This is the coldest sales chart humiliation the streaming era has ever produced, and it happened to the one artist who spent 6 months telling the entire industry he was untouchable. This is not a fluke. This is not a bad week. This is the marketplace delivering a verdict, and the verdict came back guilty on every single count Rick Ross bragged about across every single podcast he stepped inside. Fast forward to right now, because the sales chart is only the opening chapter. The moment those numbers dropped, Tony Yeo, the G-Unit soldier who has been sharpening his knives in the shadows for the better part of 2 decades, stepped to a microphone and said what every executive in every A&R meeting was already whispering. Tony Yeo pointed at Rick Ross and said the quiet part loud. Tony Yeo said Rick Ross had every advantage a working artist could ever request: the interviews, the podcasts, the physical copies, the machine, the algorithmic support any legacy name still receives, and Rick Ross still got dusted by a rapper who is currently doing time. Tony Yeo asked, out loud, on camera, in front of millions, who was the person in Rick Ross's ear that told him to vanish from music for 20 years, then drop an album, then book a world tour, then simultaneously wage lyrical warfare on every rapper still breathing. Whoever gave Rick Ross that game plan, Tony Yeo said, does not love Rick Ross, does not respect Rick Ross, does not want Rick Ross to win. That single line ricocheted across every hip-hop platform in under 3 hours. It hit Twitter, it hit Instagram, it hit TikTok, it hit every barbershop breakdown channel on YouTube, and by the time the sun set, that single sentence had transformed into the epitaph of the entire set in stone rollout. But that was only the appetizer, because the moment the industry started digesting Tony Yeo's autopsy, the one and only Curtis Jackson kicked the door open. 50 Cent, the man who has been sitting patiently in the tall grass for 2 full decades waiting for exactly this scoreboard, screenshotted the sales projections, opened Instagram, and posted 40 characters that flattened the rest of Rick Ross's rollout. I just saw your record sales, LOL. 2000. What the? 50 Cent did not need a diss track. 50 Cent did not need a studio session. 50 Cent did not need a strategy meeting. 50 Cent needed a screenshot, a laughing emoji, and a caption, and 50 Cent buried Rick Ross with a 2-line post. Because if there is one man on planet Earth who has been mentally rehearsing this exact moment since the mid-2000s, it is Curtis Jackson, and the second his post hit send, the entire hip-hop internet erupted like a fireworks stand in July. And Curtis has not slowed down since. Curtis has been dropping a fresh Rick Ross post every 12 hours like a nightly newscast, feeding the algorithm a steady stream of humiliation content that the recommendation engine cannot get enough of. Now sit with me for a moment on the psychology of what happens next, because Rick Ross's response to this humiliation is somehow more embarrassing than the numbers themselves. Rick Ross opens Instagram Live. Rick Ross is on a boat. Rick Ross is wearing a bathrobe. Rick Ross starts talking about Jean-Michel Basquiat. Rick Ross tells his remaining fans that when Basquiat was painting, Basquiat had no idea what the paintings would eventually be worth, and Rick Ross assures the audience that generations from now people will look back at Set in Stone and finally understand the masterpiece. Rick Ross, 2,000 physical copies sold, on a boat, in a bathrobe, comparing himself to Jean-Michel Basquiat. Let that image stamp itself into your memory, because this is exactly the moment the hip-hop internet stopped taking Rick Ross seriously as a rap star and started treating him as a meme. This is the moment the joke wrote itself. This is the moment every parody account on the timeline booked its rent for the rest of the fiscal quarter. Here is where the wheels really come off, and I need you to pay attention because this next segment is going to reappear in every marketing textbook written for the next decade. When Rick Ross was asked point-blank whether he believed the streaming algorithm was working against him, Rick Ross said, and this is a direct paraphrase, "Yeah, I would say so." And when the follow-up question landed, the one asking whether the algorithm turned on Rick Ross specifically because he spent 6 months attacking Drake, Rick Ross essentially confirmed it. Rick Ross admitted, on camera, that his own campaign had been polluted by his fixation on Drake. Rick Ross admitted his interviews were not about Set in Stone. Rick Ross admitted his podcast appearances were not about the music. Rick Ross admitted that the reason so many casual listeners tuned in to hear him at all was because they were hoping he would take another shot at Drake. And the exact second Rick Ross tried to convert that attention into album sales, the audience walked. Every last one of them. That is the most brutal case study in modern fan psychology hip-hop has produced this decade, and Rick Ross narrated it in real time while cruising past South Beach. That is not just a confession. That is a full public deposition in which Rick Ross accidentally testified against himself in front of the entire jury. DJ academics, love him, hate him, block him, subscribe to him, spent an entire live stream unpacking exactly what happened. And this time, even the academic skeptics could not argue the mathematics. Academics broke it down cleanly. The pick-a-side culture that governs hip-hop right now is dominated by Drake supporters. Drake fans make up roughly 70% of the mainstream hip-hop consumer base. Rick Ross supporters make up somewhere around 15%. And here is the sniper shot. Of that 15%, nearly every Rick Ross fan is also a Drake fan, but not every Drake fan is a Rick Ross fan. Which means the second Rick Ross declared war on Drake, Rick Ross voluntarily detonated between 50 and 80% of his own crossover audience. Academics called it a suicide play. And when you stack the 17,200 number against that math, the equation stops being disputable. That is not a marketing failure. That is a self-inflicted amputation of the exact fan base that was quietly bankrolling the second half of Rick Ross's career. Here comes the twist nobody has fully processed yet, because the sales chart is not the only fire burning in Rick Ross's compound right now. Rick Ross announced a 20-year anniversary world tour on the back of Set in Stone, and the tour is bleeding on the seating chart. Photos leaked from the Miami venue, Rick Ross's own hometown, the city that should sell out for him without a single ad buy, and the seating map looks like a highlighted stretch of algae. Green dots everywhere. Green dots signify unsold seats. And Rick Ross's promotional team, sensing the disaster in real time, began deploying buy one get one 50% off ticket discounts. Rick Ross's team is running Groupon-style promotions on a tour they announced as the biggest of his career, in his home city, on a Saturday night, in the middle of the summer. Let that mental picture sit. Rick Ross in a bathrobe, comparing himself to Basquiat, running 2-for-1 deals in his own zip code. That is not a tour. That is a clearance event. And this is where the receipts turn into an avalanche, because Set in Stone is not merely underperforming. Set in Stone is being outstreamed by individual songs. A single Drake record that dropped earlier this year reportedly outperformed the entire Set in Stone album in daily streams. One song, one 3-minute and change record, outpacing a 14-track project across a single afternoon. That is not a competitive gap. That is a canyon carved by the streaming era. And when you contrast that reality against Rick Ross's public claim that Iceman flopped, that Drake was washed, that Drake was 3 albums into irrelevance, that Drake wasn't on Rick Ross's level, the cinematic irony becomes almost unbearable. Rick Ross said Iceman flopped. Iceman moved hundreds of thousands of units. Rick Ross said Drake was washed. Drake is dominating the streaming leaderboards. Rick Ross said Drake wasn't on his level. Rick Ross just finished behind a rapper in a prison cell. The projections were not just wrong. The projections were inverted. Every claim Rick Ross made turned out to describe Rick Ross himself. Let me pass you another receipt, because Tony Yayo was not finished. Yayo pointed at something even the most loyal Rick Ross supporters cannot dismiss. Rick Ross's biggest hits from the second half of his career, the ones that carried his catalog into modern rotation, all featured Drake. Gold Roses featured Drake. Aston Martin Music featured Drake. Free Mason featured Drake. Lemon Pepper Freestyle featured Drake. Money in the Grave featured Drake. Every single crossover Rick Ross anthem from 2010 onward carried Drake's fingerprints on the writing, on the hook, on the streaming graph. And the moment Rick Ross ignited that bridge in public, Rick Ross did not simply cut ties with a collaborator. Rick Ross cut himself off from 15 years of algorithmic tailwind. Every time a casual listener searched a Drake track and landed on a Rick Ross feature, that was a free stream, a free discovery, a free momentum boost. Rick Ross incinerated that pipeline because Rick Ross convinced himself he could out-strategize a recommendation engine that has more behavioral data on music consumption than any human being ever will. That is not a business decision. That is a hostage negotiation with your own audience, and Rick Ross lost. Now let us talk about the actual music, because even the Rosie Rescue Committee cannot spin the track list without contorting the truth. 14 of the 19 tracks on Set in Stone are features. 14 features on a Rick Ross album in year 20 of his career. Which raises a question 50 Cent has been screaming from Shreveport for 2 weeks straight. How does an artist with more than 20 guest appearances stitched into a single project only move 10,000 streams? The math does not work. And the math not working is the reason 50 Cent has been posting every 12 hours like clockwork. 50 Cent has posted screenshots. 50 Cent has posted memes. 50 Cent has posted reaction videos. 50 Cent said Rick Ross needed the Drake stimulus package. 50 Cent said Rick Ross needed a Drake care package. 50 Cent said Rick Ross needed a Drake care package featuring even one Aubrey Graham bar to rescue the entire project. Every single one of those posts pulled tens of thousands of likes inside the first hour. Every single one of those posts got reposted by 5 other blogs. Every single one of those posts turned into another data point in the algorithm's file on Rick Ross, the failing legacy artist. Rick Ross, of course, counterpunched, because Rick Ross has never been the kind of man to swallow a jab. Rick Ross went online and told 50 Cent to return the Shreveport residents their money. Rick Ross accused 50 Cent of borrowing municipal funding, of overpromising on a film studio, of running off before the ribbon was cut. Rick Ross tried to flip the entire narrative onto 50 Cent's balance sheet. And some of Rick Ross's core defenders picked up the counterargument and ran with it. But here is the ugly problem. Nobody outside that inner circle cared. Because when your album is doing 2,000 physical copies, your comeback tweets simply do not carry weight. When your tour is offering Groupon rates, your accusations do not land. When your defense against public humiliation is a Basquiat comparison, the courtroom stops taking you seriously. Rick Ross tried to swing upward at 50 Cent, and 50 Cent did not even flinch. 50 Cent just posted another screenshot. 50 Cent just kept the ledger open. 50 Cent just let the numbers do the arguing while Rick Ross argued with his own reflection in the yacht window. Here is the pattern that connects this entire saga, and I want you to sit with it, because hip-hop history is repeating itself in front of our eyes and Rick Ross just marched into the identical trap. Every time a rapper has declared open war on Drake, every single time, that rapper's numbers have collapsed inside 12 months. It happened to Meek Mill. It happened to Pusha T in the long game. It happened to Joe Budden in a different way. And it is happening to Rick Ross in the most publicly documented form any of them ever endured. Because Drake does not have to respond. Drake does not have to release a diss track. Drake does not have to pick up a phone. Drake just has to keep uploading music, and the recommendation engine handles the rest. Drake has spent an entire decade constructing the most efficient content delivery pipeline hip-hop has ever produced, and that pipeline does not care about beef. That pipeline cares about streams. And Rick Ross unplugged himself from the outlet the exact moment he decided Drake was going to double as his marketing plan. The pattern is not coincidence. The pattern is physics. And physics does not negotiate with luxury rap veterans in bathrobes. The sermon that nobody in the media is preaching yet is this. Rick Ross forgot the single most important commandment of the streaming era. Rick Ross forgot that in 2026, hit songs sell albums. Podcasts do not sell albums. Interviews do not sell albums. Beef does not sell albums. Bathrobe philosophy does not sell albums. Hit songs sell albums. Drake has hit songs falling out of his shirt pockets. Tory Lanez, even from a cell, has hit songs. Rick Ross has speeches about Basquiat. And when you do not have a certified radio hit, and Rick Ross has not authored a genuine crossover smash since BMF, and BMF dropped more than a decade ago, the streaming algorithm classifies you as legacy inventory. Legacy inventory does not get pushed. Legacy inventory gets shelved. Rick Ross just discovered on national television that the algorithm has been quietly relegating him for years. And the worst part of that discovery is that Rick Ross was the last person in the industry to notice. The Joe Budden appearance is going to be studied in marketing seminars for the next decade, because Rick Ross walked into that studio expecting a coronation and left with a coroner's report. Joe Budden asked about Drake. Rick Ross said there was no back and forth, just one train on the track. Joe Budden asked whether Rick Ross was squashing the beef. Rick Ross deflected. Joe Budden asked about Set in Stone. Rick Ross pivoted back to Drake. Every single question about his own album, Rick Ross weaponized into another jab at Drake, which is exactly what killed him. Because the audience arrived hungry for the dices, but the audience did not arrive hungry for the album. Rick Ross fed them entertainment for free and assumed they would reward him with $16 for a physical copy. They did not. They screenshotted the shots. They laughed. They scrolled. They moved on. Free content is not a coupon for a paid product. Free content is the paid product. And Rick Ross handed the paid product away at every microphone he sat behind. Set in Stone had genuine highlights, and I will give Rick Ross the credit the rescue committee needs, because the Copers deserve at least one true handhold. The Wyclef Jean and Lucci feature is legitimately strong. The production on the mid-album stretch is top tier. Rick Ross's pen, when he actually writes, is still one of the sharpest in the entire genre. But here is the harsh reality. Nobody bought the album to find out. Nobody streamed the project long enough to discover it. The audience made up its mind about Set in Stone weeks before the release, and the audience made up its mind based on how Rick Ross carried himself in the build-up. Rick Ross carried himself like a man still living in 2012. And in 2026, that persona does not sell records anymore. The luxury rap uniform does not fit the streaming era. The Maybach and Champagne fantasy does not scan against a generation that measures wealth in equity, not exhaust pipes. There is a quiet secondary storyline unfolding with Tony Yayo, and I want you tracking it, because Yayo is not merely clowning Rick Ross for entertainment. Yayo is executing something strategic. Yayo is planting a G-Unit flag on behalf of 50 Cent, keeping the entire G-Unit legend alive, and manufacturing content specifically engineered for the demographic that grew up watching the original 50 Cent versus Rick Ross saga unfold in the mid-2000s. Yayo is generating free promotion for the G-Unit brand every time he opens his mouth about Set in Stone. Every viral clip of Yayo dunking on Rick Ross is another data point the streaming algorithm files. 50 Cent knows this. Yayo knows this. That is why the posts do not stop. That is why the screenshots keep dropping. That is why the memes keep circulating. Because in the attention economy of 2026, Rick Ross's flop is somebody else's algorithmic gold mine. And nobody in this industry has ever been more prepared to mine that gold than the G-Unit war room. Meanwhile, Drake has said absolutely nothing publicly about any of it. Drake has not posted. Drake has not subtweeted. Drake has not liked a comment. Drake has not appeared on a podcast. Drake has done what Drake always does when the room turns against a rival. Drake has stayed in his own lane, kept releasing music, and let the receipts speak on his behalf. And the receipts are speaking so loudly right now that Rick Ross can barely hear himself over the noise. Every day, another chart update lands. Every day, the gap widens. Every day, another commentator picks up the thread and rebroadcasts it. And every time the story runs, Drake's name gets stapled to Rick Ross's failure. Which means, in one of the coldest ironies of the modern era, Rick Ross's obsession with Drake is now single-handedly driving Drake's continued relevance in this news cycle. Rick Ross is providing free marketing for the exact artist Rick Ross swore was washed. That is not just poetic justice. That is the algorithm eating its own tail while wearing a Rick Ross chain. The Basquiat comparison is going to age catastrophically. I want that recorded on the timeline right now so we can all revisit this footage 6 months from today, because artists who have to publicly explain their own genius after a commercial flop rarely recover. History is a graveyard of rappers who reached for the Basquiat metaphor while the sales sheet reached back for their throats. And Rick Ross, for all his brilliance, for all his catalog, for all his business acumen, just handed every critic in the industry the exact soundbite required to keep this story running for the rest of the calendar. Every time Rick Ross gives another interview, someone will cue up the Basquiat clip. Every time a new sales figure drops, someone will cue up the Basquiat clip. The Basquiat clip is now the meme that will chase Rick Ross across every timeline for the rest of the rollout. That clip is the loop of shame that will not release him. And then there is the question of what Rick Ross does next, because Rick Ross legitimately has options. Rick Ross has Wingstop. Rick Ross has real estate holdings. Rick Ross has the annual car and bike show. Rick Ross has publishing catalog revenue. Rick Ross has licensing deals. Rick Ross is one of the most diversified income portfolios in modern hip-hop, and nobody, not even 50 Cent, disputes that ledger. Even 50 Cent, when he stops laughing long enough to catch his breath, will confirm that Rick Ross is going to be financially fine for the rest of his life. But financial survival is not the same as cultural relevance. And cultural relevance is exactly what Set in Stone was supposed to purchase back. Set in Stone was supposed to replant Rick Ross's flag at the center of the discourse. Set in Stone was supposed to prove Rick Ross was still a top 5 rapper alive. Set in Stone was supposed to silence the doubters permanently. Instead, Set in Stone became the loudest piece of evidence the doubters ever received. The album that was supposed to be the exclamation point became the question mark. Here is the meta question, and this is the one I want you dropping in the comment section below, because this is the one that will decide how the next 12 months of hip-hop unfold. Is Rick Ross finished? Or is Rick Ross secretly setting up the greatest recovery arc in modern rap history? Because both outcomes are still live on the board. Rick Ross could double back, drop a second album this year, silence the room, and re-enter the conversation on his own terms. Rick Ross could keep talking about Basquiat, keep running discount tour promotions, keep beefing with 50 Cent on Instagram, and slowly slide into the legacy artist tier the streaming era has quietly constructed for aging superstars. Both roads are visible. Both roads are open. And which road Rick Ross chooses will be the single most watched storyline in hip-hop for the remainder of this calendar year. Because in an era where every artist is one algorithmic push from a comeback, no ending is truly written until the artist walks toward the door. Let me hand you one more receipt, because this one matters more than any of the others. When Rick Ross was in his commercial prime, when Teflon Don was moving units, when God Forgives I Don't was rewriting the luxury rap textbook, when Hood Billionaire was still respected in every backseat and every barbershop, Rick Ross carried one competitive edge that separated him from every other rapper on the roster. Rick Ross could make you feel wealthy when you were broke. Rick Ross could put you inside a Maybach when you were riding the bus. Rick Ross could sit you on a yacht when you were folded into a studio apartment. That was the sonic contract Rick Ross signed with his audience for 15 straight years. And Rick Ross broke that contract the moment Rick Ross decided to become a beef aggregator instead of a fantasy architect. The audience did not walk because Rick Ross got old. The audience walked because Rick Ross stopped selling the fantasy. And inside luxury rap, the fantasy is the entire product line. When the fantasy dies, the invoice cannot be paid. Which loops us all the way back to Kendrick Lamar, because you did not think I was going to leave Kendrick out of this equation, did you? Kendrick has been quietly watching the entire hip-hop economy reorganize itself around the residue of last year's beef. Kendrick has not needed to release a single new record this quarter to remain the most discussed rapper alive. Kendrick's catalog is still charting. Kendrick's diss tracks are still in heavy rotation. And the exact pattern Rick Ross just fell inside is the identical pattern Kendrick predicted would swallow every artist who tried to ride Drake's momentum without earning their own. Rick Ross tried to earn the momentum by attacking. Kendrick earned the momentum by making better records. That is the entire lesson of the last 2 years of hip-hop compressed into a single sentence. Make better records. Rick Ross missed the assignment, and now the classroom is grading him in front of the internet. And the grade is not curved. The final piece I want to leave with you is this. Rick Ross still has the pen. Rick Ross still has the voice. Rick Ross still has the catalog. Rick Ross still has the machine. Every single tool Rick Ross needs to launch a comeback is already sitting inside the studio. But Rick Ross has to make a decision, and Rick Ross has to make it fast, because the streaming era does not slow down for legacy artists trying to negotiate with their own egos. The streaming era keeps moving. The streaming era keeps finding the next dopamine spike. The streaming era already has Tory Lanez, on a laptop, in a prison cell, outselling Rick Ross with less than a prayer. Which means the ceiling of what an artist can now achieve without traditional promotion has been permanently raised. And the floor of what a legacy artist can survive with every promotional tool in the industry has been permanently lowered. Rick Ross is standing on that lowered floor at this very moment, staring up at that newly raised ceiling, running the mathematics in his head. And every second Rick Ross wastes on Basquiat comparisons, that ceiling climbs another inch farther out of reach. Every second Rick Ross wastes defending the bathrobe on Instagram Live, another rival uploads a hit. Every second Rick Ross wastes running Groupon promotions. Another prison cell rapper reminds the industry that the machine is now built for the unreachable, not the untouchable. This is not a temporary dip. This is a structural realignment. And the artists who miss the realignment do not get invited back. They get archived. And archived is the worst word in the entire streaming vocabulary, because archived means the algorithm has already decided the artist is a museum piece, and museum pieces do not headline arenas. Museum pieces get walked past. Museum pieces get photographed and forgotten. Rick Ross was supposed to be in the exhibit hall of the Still Active. Right now, Rick Ross is on the wall next to a plaque. The Rosie Rescue Committee is going to flood the comments any minute. The Copers are going to insist the numbers do not matter. The Bosket Bailout Squad is going to tell you Rick Ross is an entrepreneur, not a rapper, and that entrepreneurs do not need chart positions. And they are half right. Rick Ross is a genuinely brilliant entrepreneur. But Rick Ross also released a rap album titled Set in Stone in year 20 of his career, and Rick Ross told every microphone in the industry that the project was going to be the album of the year. And the moment you make that promise out loud, the marketplace collects the invoice. The marketplace collected. The invoice bounced. Everything else is just footnotes on the graveyard. And the footnotes are already being written by every commentator with a working camera. The blogs are writing. The podcasters are writing. The barbershop analysts are writing. TikTok is writing. Twitter is writing. Even Rick Ross's own defenders are writing. Only they are writing damage control instead of victory laps. And damage control does not chart. Damage control is the sound of a legacy artist quietly negotiating with the receipts he refuses to acknowledge in public. And nobody in the history of hip-hop has ever damage controlled their way back to relevance. You either drop a hit or you drop the persona. Rick Ross has not shown any signal that either move is imminent. So here is the question I want you dropping directly into the comment section, because the comment section on this one is going to be legendary. Do you believe Rick Ross recovers from this? Or is this the beginning of the end of the Rosie era in mainstream hip-hop? Was Tony Yayo justified in comparing Set in Stone to Tory Lanez prison cell victory? Or is that comparison unfair given the circumstances Tory is currently living inside? Was Curtis Jackson's Instagram roast fair game? Or was 50 Cent kicking a man who was already flat on the canvas? And here is the wild card question I want you to answer honestly. Do you think Rick Ross should just pick up the phone, call Drake, squash the entire beef, feature Aubrey on the deluxe edition of Set in Stone, and reset the whole narrative in a single move? Because that option is still on the board whether Rick Ross wants to admit it publicly or not. And whichever answer you land on, the algorithm is going to feed on your comment for the next 48 hours whether you meant it to or not. Drop your take below, because if Set in Stone taught us anything, it taught us that the audience always gets the final word. And right now the audience is speaking louder than any promotional campaign Rick Ross could have paid for. If you are still standing with me at this mark, you already know the drill. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, share this video with the hip-hop fan in your group chat who has been arguing about Rick Ross for 2 weeks straight. And check out the suggested video already loading on your screen, because the next chapter of this story is unfolding as we speak. The 50 Cent versus Rick Ross round 2 is loading. The Drake response, if it ever arrives, is loading. The Tory Lanez appeal is loading. And the algorithm is watching every one of us decide which story to click on next. Make sure the next story you click on is the breakdown where we unpack exactly what Drake is preparing to do. Because when Drake finally speaks, and Drake will eventually speak, the entire hip-hop landscape is going to shift again. The register closed on Set in Stone. But the register on this saga is wide open, and we will be there when it rings. Because in a year where legacy artists have quietly discovered that the streaming era does not respect resumes, only receipts, Rick Ross just became the loudest possible case study in what happens when a boss forgets he still has to punch the clock like everyone else. And the next case study is loading right now. So click the next video, keep the tab open, and let the algorithm remember which side of the register you stood on when the numbers finally spoke. Because the machine is watching every scroll, every pause, every replay, and the machine is quietly writing the next chapter of who eats and who fades in this streaming era we are all living inside right now.